know where there's some. Right here in the hall clerk.
No, Molly, not in there. I have
Hello and welcome back. Continuing on with this GE 514 clock radio. It's been a long time since I've contributed to the YouTube videos on this, but I'm down to the last part here, which is the clock itself. This is a Telechron clock that keeps as a sweep second hand. It lets you set the alarm, and the alarm will turn on the radio, rather, and wake you up to the gentle tunes of whatever era you listen to this radio in. As I said, this is a Telechron clock. GE, by the time this radio was made, GE owned Telechron pretty much outright. Telechron is an interesting company, and if you want the real history of Telechron, this is probably the book for you. This is Electrifying Time, Telechron and GE Clocks, 1925 to 1955. Talks of some of the history, shows every imaginable. I mean, what a labor of love to assemble a book like this. Let's see. Oh, Jim Lenz. That's who wrote it. The author is Jim Lenz. Telechron Electronic Clocks Timetable by Jim Lenz. It's a Schiffer book for collectors, as it says here. This is a fine document, and it describes what is actually a pretty fine piece of American technology and history. Henry E. Warren is the guy that came up with these. He established Telechron in 1912 in Ashland, Massachusetts, this is an electric clock, but what he started out doing was making battery-powered clocks, which were pretty inaccurate, and that disturbed him. He didn't care for that, so he invented this motor, which is in here. This is a synchronous AC motor. Invented the first version of this in 1915. And by synchronous AC motor, it has it's the RPMs of the motor, the revolutions per minute of the motor, are tied directly to the frequency of the AC current driving the motor. This is a shaded pole motor. These are the shades right here and here. And given the position of these shades, I would say that this motor turns this way. But if you know transformers at all, you will realize that these laminated steel pieces produce a pretty good magnetic field right around this piece right here on this radio. And inside that little piece at nubbin is a couple of vanes or rotors, flat rotors, that turn the gearing in this part of the motor to make the clock run. He did that in 1915 and was pretty pleased with the idea, except that every power station, which by the time he did this had been switched mostly to 60 hertz AC. There was still probably a few DC generators around, and certainly some 25 hertz or 50 hertz generators around too. But the 60 hertz ones were what this one was built for. And not all power stations in 1915 generated AC at exactly the same frequency. So what Warren did was in 1919 developed a master clock, which contained a synchronous clock like his, and a good old-fashioned pendulum clock that was tied to to the Naval Observatory to keep its time, so that they compare the frequency of the power station via the clock versus the actual time kept by the Naval Observatory, and keep them in sync, thereby ensuring that the 60 hertz clock or 60 hertz power generators were indeed running at 60 hertz, which also, interestingly enough, allowed the power grids to be interconnected. If two power grids in those days, let's say one was running at 58 hertz and the other was running at 61 hertz, you couldn't couple them together. You couldn't supplement one grid with the other because they were running at different frequencies. Well, Warren's invention of the master clock allowed the power stations to be coupled together, and by 1947, word has it that there were about 95% of the power stations in the United States were using Warren master clocks. I presume they're all digitized these days, but it would be interesting to see if they have the original master clocks around. By 1943, Henry E. Warren retired from Telechron. It had been purchased, GE bought a piece of it in 1917 and over time absorbed Telechron into the GE hierarchy. And in 1943, Warren retired. Timex purchased the Telechron company from GE around 1978. But sadly, Telechron went out of business in its original form in 1992. I'm told that there are a couple of companies around the United States that make something and call themselves Telechron, but it isn't this. So that's kind of the history of this clock. It has a fascinating history. It's a kind of a genius idea. And what I want to do is make this one run again. It's been sitting, it's got its, as far as I can tell, it's got its original grease and oil. No grease, just oil. But it's very stiff. You can turn the hands, but boy, they're grabby. And to be honest with you, I haven't tried to power the motor up. I know if the motor hasn't been serviced, and I expect it has never been serviced, the oil that's in there is probably pretty gummy and turned to varnish. So we'll have to get some new lubricant inside the motor. But that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this apart. I'm going to take the motor out of it, lube it, and see if we can get it running again. And then we'll lubricate all the various gears. This is, as I said, this is the motor here. And as you can see up in here are all the gears that run the hands. And there aren't that many. It's not as complicated as some clocks, but there are plenty of gears in there. And to be honest, I don't want to take this apart. I just want to expose enough of the gears so I can get out there and add some clock oil into those rub spots so that it runs freely again. That's the goal. So the instructions on working on this come in two places. The Electrifying Time book has a section on servicing, and also a warning right here on this page about WD-40 poisoning. If you look at this clock face, this is rather pristine. It looks great. No scratches, no stains, no nothing. It just looks fabulous. It's conceivable, I should mention as an aside, it's conceivable that, well, not on this clock, I don't think it is. Certainly some of these clocks had glow-in-the-dark feature, which meant the numbers were painted in a thick radium paint. This one is smooth as can be, so I doubt it glowed in the dark. But be aware of that if you ever decide to service one of these yourselves. Don't lick, don't lick it. don't touch it, lick your fingers. You'll get a slight case of radium poisoning. But WD-40, apparently, according to this book, WD-40 will permanently and forever stain this clock face. So you absolutely do not want to use WD-40 in lubricating in here at all. And it shouldn't be necessary. So this, as I said, this book has some ideas on how to restore the rotor to working condition. Primarily, the instructions say, take the motor out. It's pretty much a sealed unit. Take the motor out, heat it up in a double boiler until it's hot, and then immerse the whole thing in a jar of oil and let it absorb the oil. I may or may not do that. It sounds a bit funny to me, but as we get to there are a couple of other approaches which sound equally dodgy to me as well. So anyway, if you're interested in restoring this and you're interested in old clocks, this is a good source for the Telechron electronic clocks. The other document I have is the service manual, the John F. Ryder service for this clock radio, and it talks about how to clean and service the clock also. And it also mentions right here in green, I don't know if you can read that, but that says carbon tetrachloride. Carbon tet used to be a great cleaner. You could get bottles of it when I was young. You could get bottles of it to clean almost anything. What we didn't know at the time was it would also cause brain damage, which may explain a lot of things in my case. So anyway, the old writer's documentation suggests you use carbon tetrachloride to clean the clock gears. Don't do that. Don't do that unless you want a serious case of brain damage, ultimately. Carbon tet is too much. So I think we'll skip cleaning the gears. We'll just lube them. We'll figure out how to get lube inside the Telechron motor itself and see how that goes. So I've blabbed on enough for this particular opening video. I will get myself set up, and in the next part we'll start to take this clock apart per these instructions. So I'll see you next time. Bye.
The makers of Johnson's Wax.